Well, who are you? I said, I'm Donna's daughter. And she slammed the phone down.
Welcome back to Family Twist. Today we're diving headfirst into a topic that's bound to leave you stunned: black market babies. Yeah, you heard that right. We're uncovering the hidden world of illegal adoptions and the shocking stories behind them. We'll be speaking with Diana, who found out that she was a black market baby only after an astonishing series of events that included DNA tests, cross-country searches, and confronting family secrets. Now, you might be thinking, how could something like this happen? But believe us, the black market for babies was much more widespread than you'd imagine. We'll break down how these networks operated and why so many families turned to them out of desperation. Let's get started. Diana, welcome to the show.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I think today, when people hear the term black market baby, it certainly raises eyebrows, but I don't think people quite comprehend what that means and how common it was in a certain period of time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
First of all, I didn't know anything. I was a late discovery. And then I found out that I was born in Montreal instead of Manhattan. My original birth certificate says Manhattan. And it did take a lot of research. And I did eventually meet the man who made arrangements. And, they weren't legal arrangements. And through the black market, it was very popular. I was born in the baby scoop era, so I'm born in the mid-50s. And 1940s to 1980s, actually, in Canada, was the baby scoop era. And they were sold, there were thousands of infants sold through this market. And it was sold in Quebec. There were baby smugglers, lawyers, doctors, and there were illegal maternity homes. They were all involved in this. And they did target Canadians and American Jewish families. I was sold to an Orthodox Jewish family, and they thought they were getting a Jewish baby.
Wow. I mean, how does something like that even come together? It's just...
Well, this particular person, I think he was just very much involved with a lot of different unethical sales and was probably had his hand in a little bit of everything. But I think what made it a little bit harder, my father, my raised father, I could say now, the father that raised me, thought he knew this man's father. And I guess he thought he was the real deal. Like they had trouble, it was the 50s. They probably had trouble getting a baby. Now, my brother, I have a brother. Obviously, he's not my biological brother. He didn't know anything. He was born in 1947. He was adopted legally through New York services. And my question has been for a long time, if you adopted the first time legally,
Right.
what? And the only thing I could think of now, because my birth certificate is full of lies. I have several birth certificates. My parents were older parents,
Mm-hmm.
and there was probably a shortage of babies. They wanted a Jewish baby, and I believe they thought they were getting a Jewish child. Thank goodness my DNA, otherwise my son would kill me, still has 10%. So
Well, it becomes an identity crisis, right?
everything goes away. And I remember when I was first told, I blanked out. I didn't believe what I was hearing. It was just unbelievably shocking. You don't forget that day, though.
Wow. Now, did your parents tell your brother that he was adopted, or was it kept from both of you?
He seems to recall, because we found a book amongst his belongings, The Chosen Baby. He seems to recall. They probably said one time they told him. My mother that raised us, she got cancer when I was 9, and she died before I was 11. So I lost her early in life. And my father, too, I lost him. Fortunately, I was 25 when I lost my father. So I lost both my parents early. He never said anything. Did I always feel something different? I just thought it was strange. I would always say, how come I'm so dark and they're so light and they're all short and I'm tall? And I was goes, oh, you look like your grandparents. And they'd actually pull out a picture of the grandparents or the great-grandparents in the old country. And you know how that goes.
So did they share the information of how they got you with anyone else?
I don't think my mother ever knew the real story. What I did find out, the man who arranged everything, I was supposed to be born in September and I came a month early.
Oh.
So when they did cross the border eventually after I was born several weeks later, I don't know if it was a week, 3 weeks, a month. I'm not sure of the time frame with that. I wasn't able to nail that down completely, but it was shortly after I was born. I would say within a month. They crossed the border as a family. They drove to Plattsburgh, New York, and then they went on to Lake Placid. And there my father, Manny, and his friend were there. My mother was not there. I guess maybe she didn't want to know. I don't think he ever told her completely everything, because I did find out that my mother refused. There were no papers. So that's why when people say, well, you were adopted, yes, but there were still no papers. I'm not legally adopted. In terms of how it's easier to speak to adoptees and everybody, it's better to say, yes, you're adopted, but I'm really legally not. She wouldn't sign the papers. She did relinquish me to the Hochbergs. And in exchange, she was given money for college. She was also given money for dental work and a one-way ticket back to Vancouver, BC, Canada. That's where she was originally from. And she did return there, and then shortly after returned to Montreal because she met the man who did the exchange, and she said she wanted the baby back.
Oh,
But it doesn't work that way.
no.
So
My assumption is she didn't have much information about where you ended up.
I believe she did know, because one of the part of the deal, even though there was no legal adoption, was to send picture of the baby. And I did find out she had a couple of pictures of me, and that I can't even imagine. She had a couple of pictures of me as I was growing up.
Wow.
And I don't mind sharing it. It's in my book. Later on in life, I do find out that I was supposed to meet her, actually, in 1967. My mother that raised me died in 1966. There was supposed to be a meetup in New York, and that it didn't happen. She didn't show up. We were there, but it didn't show up. And I didn't know why. I mean, my father told me it was Mother's Day, and a friend was coming in from Montreal, and she always wanted to see New York.
Wow. But it sounds like your father must have had a change of heart if he was willing to let you meet her.
Right. I don't know what happened that day. That's still kind of a mystery. There's all different stories out there what happened. And that's in my book too. There's a lot of different ways it could have gone. But I remember as a child being I know he was expecting to meet this person and they didn't show up. And we were at the Plaza Hotel called the Tea Room or something. It was a special. I mean, he made it a special occasion. And, I'm sure it was heart-wrenching for him. I didn't know. Well, as I know, if I would stay at home, I had a birthday party I wanted to go to that day. I didn't get to go to my neighbor's birthday party.
So was it a DNA test that finally led you on the track of discovery?
No, actually, I found this out originally in 1993. I had been widowed very young. I took a trip out to Las Vegas, and my son was with me, and we were visiting some friends. One of my dad's friends from New York, him and his wife had relocated out there. He took me to lunch. And over lunch was one of those really old-fashioned diners with all the leather seats and the whole bit, the jukebox and everything. He's saying, it's such a shame you lost your parents so early. You lost your husband. Do you want me to help you find your parents? And I'm like, what?
Right.
What?
So his assumption was that you knew.
Well, and then I could tell he just realized something was not off, and it got very quiet, and it was hard to finish, and he tried changing subjects. And I actually remember going back to the hotel, and my friends that were, I was staying at the same hotel. I said, you need to take my son David. And I remember going in the room, minibar.
Yeah.
You know what happened next.
Oh my gosh.
And then I do remember calling my brother in New York. He worked for a newspaper, and he never answers the phone, and he answered the phone. And I remember drilling him. Do you know where I was? Where were you when I was born? Where were you? Because he's almost 8 years older.
Right.
And he says, well, I wasn't home. He was at an aunt's house. They were at the Jersey Shore. So they were visiting relatives. They had him out of town.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they did. He says, I don't know. Sometimes mommy was skinny. Sometimes she was fat. I don't know. I don't know. It wasn't. Some kids are more observant than others.
Yeah.
And he just really doesn't recall. And then he said to me, well, what does your birth certificate say? And that was the start of it, getting my, and here it is, I've already been married and I don't have a birth
Yeah.
certificate. I have a social security, but my father took care of all that. So I never, and they said, well, how'd you get married without a birth certificate? I said, well, I was working in felonies for a judge at the time. I worked for the judge. You think they're not going to think who I am?
Exactly.
So that's how it was back then.
If your family and neighbors saw you appear, then yeah, that's your parents' kid,
Right. Well, and I remember asking relatives when I started doing the hunt. This is, I didn't immediately, when I got back from Vegas, I didn't immediately go out and, okay, I decided I have to go get my birth certificate. And that took a while to get. And then I didn't understand why the first one was blank. I mean, I had no name on the first one. But then, where it says down there, previous births, 0. And that's when it's like, but my parents' ages were wrong. The information was wrong. There were all these different handwritings on here. It was pretty obvious that something was not right.
Wow.
And to fast forward, I had a caseworker and I had gotten a hold of him several times. And he said, you had another birth certificate coming, an amended one. And there'd been 2 amended ones. He said, you're one of 52 cases and I have to close this out this year. And then I said, well, I believe I was adopted and boom, boom. He said, there's no record of you being adopted in the state of New York. There's 0 record. So case closed.
Yeah.
That's what they did.
It's so interesting because nowadays it feels like there would be a paper trail, right? There would be a hospital record of a birth. Right. Yeah, that just feels like it would be more difficult now.
I contacted, thinking I was born in New York, I contacted that hospital and everything like that. There was no, I didn't get anywhere. We all have learned there are fake birth certificates.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm still resentful that my birth certificate, my parents adopted me through the state and everything, but I just think it's so strange that the only birth certificate that I have lists my adoptive parents as the parents, and that my mother was 35 when I was born. And it's a lie. It's just a bold-faced lie. Even they felt weird about it. They were like, we know that you need names on there, but this is false. You know what I mean? This is not real.
Well, yeah, because my real mother, my bio mother, she was only like 18, and here they have this, the one I was raised with Down, and she was 35.
Mm-hmm. You and I are similar.
So I thought of you when I listened to that.
My mom died exactly 1 week after she turned 46.
Mine was 3 months after she was 46. Yep. So I did think of you when I listened to that.
Yeah, I mean, I knew I was adopted, but she was the only mom I'd ever had, So.
Yeah, but you knew you were adopted.
Yeah.
And that's it. I didn't know. And I just, I asked a lot of questions all the time, and I just don't. There were opportunities, and maybe when I was in college or something. I mean, I believe telling them soon as possible.
Absolutely.
Now that I've been through this, and not just one time. I believe you have to keep reiterating it and reading them books and telling them you didn't come out of mommy's stomach, and the whole story. You have to keep enforcing it and use the verbiage and everything. I mean, and I loved my dad. My dad, he was my idol. He was a great man. He taught me to bike, fish, swim, everything. Mm-hmm. He was a good man. But this, I don't understand.
Yeah.
You just have to accept it.
Yeah.
Because he was not a bad person. Right. I mean, he was, knowing that what I know now, how I was fortunate in many ways, now that I know my whole story, that I was placed with them, even though their circumstances, if that makes sense.
Yep.
My mother, she wasn't warm, fuzzy. You needed that hugger or something. You didn't get that from her. Mm-hmm. Well, I wasn't her child.
Yeah.
And some even adopted parents are more giving that way or more loving that way. She probably didn't know how.
It's interesting because I feel like with both my adoptive parents, they were the complete opposite of that. Really affectionate. They were affectionate with each other. I often joke and say I would catch them kissing, and as a toddler or a little kid, you're like giggly, and I was like, you guys stop that. But they were really affectionate with me. To your point, I feel really fortunate that that was what I had.
I feel my father was. I feel he was trying to make up, and they were affectionate with each
Mhm.
other. Every Friday night, as I said, I was raised in a modern Orthodox Jewish
Mhm.
home. He brought home flowers every Friday. We had special
Yep.
dinner and the whole bit. So it's just, I think she tried. I think she tried. She just didn't. There was just something that didn't. Looking back now, that I could figure so much more out.
Hmm. And maybe, if her health was in jeopardy, I wonder if that could have affected her that way.
Right. And that's another thing. I mean, I know she got sick. I remember my father screaming in the house, "You've never been sick." And all, they were married 26 years.
Mhm.
"You've never been sick a day since I've met you."
Going back to 1993, and this is, obviously pre at home DNA tests. You couldn't go that route. Like, how do you?
So going back to that, I did research. I went to the library. After I found out who this man was and we had conversation finally on the phone, we didn't talk right away. When he finally did talk, he said he had to talk to his lawyer
Mm.
first. He had to see, because he wanted to make sure that he couldn't do, it was too many years. What is that kind of statutes of
Yep.
limitations, which they really don't have in Canada, but it had been so many years.
Right.
So he spoke to his lawyer, and that's how I was able to find out the story, how he took me across the border. But as far as finding out who my mother was, then he said he knew. He knew her when I started calling Vancouver. This is before I found out everything. Everybody with that last name and one of the phone calls, I didn't know I was speaking to my biological uncle.
Mm.
Wow. Wow.
I was making these calls, and I said, "Do you know anybody by so and so name, this and that too?" And she said, "Well, that's my sister." "Oh, she remarried." And I said, "Oh." And so I said that I went to school. I told a little
Oh, yeah.
fib, and he says, "Oh, give me a minute. I'll give you her address and phone number."
Wow.
So he gave me everything. I recall calling my aunt, and of course, she wasn't happy with the phone call. And she said she knew about me. This one aunt knew about me.
Mm.
My grandmother did not. The, the uncles did not. The others just, there were 5
Mm.
children. But this one knew about me.
Wow.
I said to her, "I know you're going to find this call very strange," but I mentioned the man's name, "Do you know more in Montreal?" And he said, "Well, who are you?" I said, "I'm Donna's daughter." And she slammed the phone down. I did call back. She says, "Listen, Donna did have a daughter, but she lives in New York. You said you're calling from Florida." I said, "Well, I lived in New York, but I live in Florida." She wasn't very nice.
Mm.
She actually called him in Montreal. So I knew there was something more up than I
Mhm.
thought, because she obviously, that's how that started. That's how that research started. I was doing it on my own. I was doing newspaper articles. I was doing microfinch. I knew all about Canada from Montreal, Toronto, to the whole shebang. I did a lot of that back then, because that's what you
Yep.
did.
You'd probably go down a lot of rabbit holes that you didn't need to. You know what I mean? Like,
Oh, I did. I went down a lot of rabbit holes that were totally not, and then people give you misinformation,
Right.
and it's just how it is,
it is.
unfortunately.
It is.
But then I did find out. She called back, and she was very different attitude, very loving, very caring.
Mm.
She told me about a little bit about my mother. She mailed me a 3-page letter telling me all about my mother, and you know, she was the only one. There were 5 children, and they grew up poor. And my mother was the only one that went on to college. She left home early. She moved to Montreal. And she started saying, she loved doing photography, which is very interesting because I do a lot of
Yeah.
photography, and just different things. The way the certain books she read, it was the type of books that I like to read. And she's an avid swimmer. But the one thing, which I'm not a good skier, well, back then I did ski. I didn't understand why I had to learn to ski, but I was never a really good skier, but I tried. But she skied all over. She actually didn't tell me much. She told me, but she didn't tell me much. She said, She didn't have any illnesses, so it was a shock when she passed away before her 30th birthday. So that opened up another rabbit hole.
Mhm.
That's another chapter in my story, what went on there. And I did get to meet them in 1994. It's very interesting how I got to meet them, if I may share. I went to, after back and forth having phone messages from her, she was the only one out of the relatives that I had spoke to. I hadn't spoke to my uncle again because she asked me not to call him. I respected her wishes. And he was living with my biological grandmother. He was taking care of her. I had decided I was going to take a trip to Canada. I had lost my job, so I went and got another job. So I ended up working for Continental Airlines back then. And it was great because now I have flight benefits.
Yeah.
So that following summer, I told my son we're going on an adventure. I said, listen, we're going to meet family. He didn't really know what was going on. He said, oh, okay. He liked the idea of going on the plane, and going on. And we got bumped up to first class. That's all he cared about. And I said, and we flew into Seattle. And then I remember renting a car and we took the ferry over with the car. So I made it an experience for him too, because I had to think of, I don't know what we're getting into. No idea what we're getting into. I mean, he already had so much loss in his life. I wanted to keep this as a positive experience for my son. So we went to my aunt's house. She lived in Burnaby. We got there and I got out of the car. And again, I said to my son, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to stay or we're going to go to a hotel. Well, my aunt saw me and she called me Donna instead of Diana. Yeah. And she just started bawling. Yeah. And she invited us in. And it was very, very strange. I mean, it's a beautiful on top of the mountain looking over, sort of like a Virgin River type of a scene. It was just so surreal. And we sat at this big table and, I think she was staring and staring, and my mannerisms and everything. And she didn't say much about my mother that day, but she said I had plenty of chores for your son while he was here. She has a big garden. And he said, chores? Chores? What do you mean? We're on holiday, Her husband, this was her second husband, he raised horses. So we got to go to the horse races. Wow. So that was definitely different. Yeah. And we were there for several days. And I said, I want to meet my grandmother. And she says, well, she doesn't believe that Donna had a child. Oh. She doesn't want to meet you. I said, well, then there's no reason for me to stay. Won't take me to my other aunt's house. You won't take me to meet my uncle. And I came so far. And she decided then I did get to meet my other aunt, which lived out in Langley, which is about an hour out of town. And that was a whole different dynamics. She was this warm, cosmopolitan, wonderful. Again, she called me Donna. She was married for 18 years, and now she has a partner. Wonderful woman. I was just so glad that she was so happy that she found somebody that she cared about. And so she was a wonderful experience. She was more what I would have expected from a relative. I felt there was a connection. She was opposite. They were opposite in their demeanor. They were opposite in their looks. They were opposite how she treated me. She was a really wonderful, and she was into the arts. This is the strangest thing. She had this big house, and she says, I want to give you a tour. So I'm touring around. I don't really see any pictures, but I see all these things like from travels. And there was a set of hands, and she must have had hundreds of pieces. And she says, out of everything in my house, you picked out the one piece that your mother gave me. She says, I want you to have the hands. I said, I can't take them. And my other aunt says, you're not going to give her those. That's the only thing you have it done. And I said, I can't take it. So I didn't take it because that's the only thing she had of her sister. But it was just so, out of hundreds of items, how do you just pick out the one thing?
Right.
That's like mind-boggling.
At any point, did you ask either of your aunts if they knew anything about your birth father?
Yes, I did. That's when I started to ask. I said, and this is it's a lot of twists in my story. Anything about my birth father? Well, what do you need to know? You got us. I said, well, do you know? Was she dating anybody? Well, my my aunt's partner, Marty, she said, "Oh, did I tell her already? It was the guy in the West End." West End. So they all told me it's the guy on the West End of Vancouver. So you have to keep in mind, I have a family name of a guy on the West End of Vancouver. And they said, well, he's Italian and has a brother, and you don't want to have anything to do with that family. Oh. Okay. So now at least I have a last name. Okay. But my trip wasn't about that. That was really about more meeting my mother, right, my aunts, my grandmother. But it was nice to walk away knowing something that I could down the road, because I had to take baby steps, even myself. I had to take baby steps. You could take so much. You have to pace everything out. I had a career. I had a child to raise. I had a lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I remember I still hadn't met my grandmother. And so to the cemetery, this was very interesting. The cemetery is 10 minutes away from my aunt's house. Now, they were Ukrainian, and I thought old school, I don't know, being raised in a different culture. Don't you usually go to the cemetery once in a while or visit? You said you were so close and she was your favorite sister. Talking about my mother, they seem really close. As a family, they seem really close. She says, "I never been to the cemetery." And I'm like, "What? You've never been to the cemetery?" Well, my aunt, the one where I was staying, she had also lived in Montreal for a short time, I found out later on. When my mother passed away, supposedly in Vancouver, my aunt was still in Montreal and didn't go back for the funeral.
Mm-hmm.
Another flag in my head. And I'm going to tie in when that timing was the same weekend that I was supposed to meet her in New York.
Oh,
got it.
So we did go to the cemetery and we did stop. They got flowers, and my son says, "We have to get the pink roses." I said, "Why pink roses?" "Oh, because Aunt Jen said that Grandma loves pink roses, so we have to get her oodles of pink roses." It made me cry. He'd never been to a cemetery. I didn't put him through that before.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was interesting, but it was strange. I can't explain it. It was very strange. But I still can't get over why my aunts had never been to the cemetery.
Yeah, that is odd.
So that brought up another question to me. And then, I met the grandmother. They decided I was either going to leave or I was going to meet the grandmother. And that was quite an experience, if I may say. She went through the Depression. And she lived as if she was still going through the Depression. So it's very sad. She called me Donna, too, and started crying. And when she saw me, because she didn't believe anything. But as soon as she saw me, though, that changed everything.
Wow.
And that was interesting. The first time I met her was very interesting. We toured the house. My uncle, he lived in the house. He built a lot of the house. He spoke 5 languages, and so did my mother.
Wow.
I found that 5 languages, which I found was very fascinating. He'd been in Japan, he'd been in the service, but I also believe back then they didn't say it, but I believe he was on the spectrum of Asperger's. Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
He went in the other room with my son, and he comes out wearing a Japanese costume with a samurai. He was like, "Oh, okay."
Your son probably thought was really cool.
It was really cool until he started swinging around. It didn't get so cool.
Like, "Uncle, I'd like to keep my head."
It was definitely an interesting day.
So, obviously there's a million thoughts going through your head at this time, but were you at all thinking like there was foul play?
I didn't think at that time, but something didn't add up because it seemed that none of them went to the cemetery. So what? Then I found out through, different conversations. So I did feel that something is not, like say not kosher, something was off, something's not. But I didn't pay much attention at the time. I was just we knew we had to work on our relationship, getting to know each other. And my grandmother, she had given me some cards. She wrapped them up. It was very sweet. She put it on some papers and stuff and, some prayers and everything. And $50 bill. She says, "I even got you American money." She lived till she was 90. Wow. God bless her. And we kept in touch for a number of years. I had made a couple of trips out there, but the more questions I asked about who my father was, the more they kind of resented it. And then we were interviewed once by the newspaper there because I had found my family in Canada, but my relatives would not be in the picture. They didn't want to have anything to do it. They didn't want to have their name out there or anything, which I thought that was a little weird.
Yeah.
Wow, what an incredible journey we've started today. Diana's story has been nothing short of astonishing, and we're just scratching the surface. In our next episode, we'll dive even deeper into the shocking twists and turns in Diana's story, including a famous photograph and possible connections to the mafia that will leave you speechless. You don't want to miss the incredible stories and shocking truths we still have to share. And remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. The Family Twist podcast is presented by Savoir-Faire Marketing Communications, produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage LLC, and features original music by Cosmic Afterthoughts.